I want to make sure at this point in the conversation we decipher between, we've been talking about this internal clock and setting that using light. This ties into sleep, but they're slightly different.
Yeah.
So as we're talking about all these different complications that can occur, how much of that is due to our internal clock falling out of sync, affecting sleep, and then that being, say, primary, secondary, and then tertiary being all these negative effects you talked about, versus the internal clock being a separate domain in and of itself?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, Jesse, because what we've coined the phrase SCARD, which means sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, SCARD, because it's very difficult to disentangle what's an inappropriately aligned clock versus sleep disruption and sleep loss. So these are intimately connected. Now, you're right. The clock isn't just driving sleep. Sleep is immensely complicated. It's this essentially flip-flop between consciousness and sleep, involving a massive realignment of every brain neurotransmitter and multiple bits within the brain. And that's timed by the clock. It timestamps and says, now is the appropriate time for consciousness, now is the appropriate time for sleep. But there's another factor, which is perhaps the most intuitive factor about sleep, which is independent of the clock to some extent, which is from the moment we wake in the morning, sleep pressure, the need to go to sleep, rises and rises and rises. And then once we're asleep, it dissipates. And so sleep pressure is very, very low in the morning. So what happens during the day, and this is really exciting, because as the sleep pressure builds, the circadian clock is saying, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. So late afternoon, early evening, ironically, just before we go to bed, the circadian drive for wakefulness is at its very highest, counteracting this sleep pressure that's been built up during the day. Then the clock says, okay, time for sleep. The sleep pressure kicks in and the clock will be saying, you should be asleep, you should be asleep, sleep. And then as you approach morning, the sleep pressure, of course, is declined. And then the clock is saying, yeah, you might want to start thinking about waking up. And so when the clock's wakefulness drive exceeds that low level of sleep pressure, that's when we wake up. So these two things must be aligned for good sleep regulation. And the problem is, of course, is night shift work. So the assumption has been by many employers is that the clock will adapt with the demands of working at night. And it doesn't. In fact, it doesn't adapt at all, or very little. What's happening, of course, is you're getting dim light in the workplace. Then on the drive home in the morning, you're getting bright natural light. The clock always defers to the brighter light signal as being daytime. So the clock of a night shift worker and a day shift worker are broadly the same. So what's happening is that during the night shift, the circadian system is saying, hang on, you should be asleep. So the wakefulness drive is really low. But you're having to, but you haven't slept. So the sleep pressure is huge, absolutely huge. So you finish the night shift, you go home, sleep pressure is high, so you fall asleep pretty quickly. But then, of course, the clock is saying, hang on, it's daytime. You should be awake. So many night shift workers get very short duration sleep during the day after the night shift. It can be as little as 5 hours. So, and that's a good example of a misalignment between the sleep need, the sleep pressure, and the biological clock.
So when it comes to night shift workers, you're talking about it there in a practical sense, how for most people, it's not going to be something that they can sync up. But for somebody who is, say, tuning into this and they're aware of light and they put in proper precautions, theoretically, can they switch that internal clock?
Yeah, I mean, so some studies from Harvard actually did that. They increased the amount of light in the workspace to 2,000 lux or more, I think it was. And then they hid them from natural light during the day. And just like when you fly across multiple time zones, those individuals adapted. And there's a real world example of this. In the North Sea, the people who work on the oil rigs, they're out on the platforms at night, these vast, great, sort of light banks, and then they're sleeping during the day in windowless metal boxes, and they adapt. Trouble is, They don't like it because 2 weeks on, 2 weeks they go back for shore leave, and they're 12 hours shifted from their friends and family. And so when asked, where would you rather feel impaired? When you're socializing for your 2 weeks of shore leave, or while you're working on the rigs, they would prefer to be sort of better adapted during the shore leave and feel grotty on the rigs. So it's very interesting. In theory, we could shift them, but a lot of people don't want to be shifted. And of course, practically, it's very difficult for many workers from hiding from light during the day, because that's when a lot of other activities are sort of going on. I mean, for many individuals, particularly women, it's the only time you can combine a family with your career. Many nurses, for example, choose to do the night shift because they can get the kids off to bed. They go on the night shift. They're back before the kids are going off to school. It's a brutal regime.
So other than the light piece, for somebody that is in that boat, are there certain quote unquote hacks or things people can do to make that transition to working nights more smoother on the body and the internal clock?
Well, I think you raise a really important issue here, and it relates to the duty of care of an employer to their employees. So, for example, you finish the night shift and you drive home. Well, a study from the UK showed that 57% of junior doctors had either had a crash or a near miss on the drive home. So you should be advising those individuals, or indeed supplying them with devices that go on the dashboard which tell you if the car is moving laterally or if it's detecting head nod, and that will set off an alarm to show that you're falling asleep. And of course, high-end German cars at the moment have that technology built into them, and I think we're going to see that increasingly. You see poor physical health. We talked about poor cognitive health in night shift workers, but what you also have is altered stress responses, you have cardiovascular disease, you have obesity, you have metabolic abnormalities. And so what are we giving our night shift workers to eat? Well, it's fast food, high in fat, high in sugar, vending machines full of chocolate bars. What we should be providing our night shift workers is protein-rich, easy-to-digest food. And to my knowledge, nobody's actually doing that to mitigate some of these problems that you get in terms of metabolic abnormalities in our night shift workers. Poor physical health generally. Why aren't we having higher frequency health checks? Who are those in those individuals who are vulnerable? So we can catch diabetes 2, for example, or obesity before these conditions become chronic and become much more difficult to treat. Another area would be in some night shift workers have a divorce rate that's 6 times higher than the equivalent day shift. So we need to provide education to alert not only the worker of what's going to happen to them, but to their extended family or the group of people that they're living with. So, you've married this partner who's this fantastic, empathetic, great sense of humor, lots of fun, and they've turned into this sort of morose, irritable monster. And it's not their fault. It's an inevitable consequence of working outside, forcing their biology to do something which it shouldn't do. And that's be active when their biology is telling them to be asleep. So there are things that we can do. Other areas, there's lots of confusion about apps and sleep apps and all the rest of it. There's masses of stuff there. We could improve education in that sector. And I suppose one final area would be, well, there's morning people and there's evening people, and most of us are somewhere in between. You could relatively easily chronotype your workforce. Obviously this would be a voluntary thing, but knowing that you're on the owl spectrum, you would be better doing the night shift. You certainly don't want to be one of the groups coming in on the early, in the morning shift. So try and fit the body clock type to the particular shift schedule you're going on. And to some extent, you see that happening naturally in taxi drivers. And, you know, I can never resist sort of saying, well, how do you sleep? Are you constant nights? Are you constant early morning? And they said, yeah, you know, so I find it better just to be, you know, night shift worker and all the time. And it works for their particular body clock. Now, most of us are in the middle, so we're only talking about a relatively small number, but it would make sense just to match their biology onto their demands of work.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the 24/7 society is here to stay. Our economies are dependent upon night shift work. I don't think we always have to do night shift work. I think, you know, just because we can doesn't mean to say we should. But, you know, our frontline staff, our nurses, our doctors, they have to be there, and as do many other our firefighters, our police, and so there are ways of mitigating some of the problems. The other really important point, and it hasn't been tested, is that some of the really major health problems, cardiovascular disease, you know, metabolic abnormalities, and the risk of cancer, it's worth bearing in mind that the studies on nurses, for example, and their higher rates of colorectal cancer and breast cancer are now so robust, those studies, the World Health Organization has classified night shift work as a probable carcinogen. So, you know, we need very much to be sensitive to those issues.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
So the shorthand for melatonin that you read all the time is that it's a sleep hormone, and it most emphatically is not. But what does caffeine do? Well, it blocks adenosine receptors within the brain, so it masks